Please like the video, it means the world. Because what Premier League defenders were dealing with when Yannick Bolasie got rolling did not look normal. And no, we are not going to pretend he literally embarrassed every single defender who ever faced him. But for a stretch at Crystal Palace, it absolutely felt like England had no rid on him. Fans were not losing their minds because he did empty tricks in harmless areas. They were losing their minds because the tricks kept turning into real damage. Title race pain for Liverpool, survival points for Palace, and fullbacks getting dragged into moments they clearly had not rehearsed. That is why people reacted the way they did. And that is why this story still works years later. That first minute is everything for retention because it answers the 3 football questions people care about fastest. What happened? A winger with raw street ball flair kept producing moments defenders could not read. Why are fans reacting? Because the clips were not just pretty, they changed games that mattered. Why does it matter now? Because when you revisit Palace's rise, Liverpool's title collapse, or the Sunderland explosion, Bolasie is all over the footage. He is not being dragged into this story after the fact. He is at the center of the scenes people still replay when they talk about Premier League chaos merchants. What made Bolasie hit differently was that his flair was not cosmetic. Crystal Palace's own official clip literally describes one of his signature moments as a 3-6-0 trademark skill against Christian Eriksen, and the Premier League's own retrospective on Palace vs Liverpool says his trickery was on full display as he twisted through the defense to create a goal. That matters, because the title and thumbnail are really making one promise. This was a player with an African street football flavor who brought something unusual into one of the most coached, most structured leagues on earth. That part is absolutely fair. And before the injuries, before Everton, before the loans and the what-if debates, there was a period when Bolasie was not just a cult favorite. He was the chaos button. Palace's own report on his Sunderland demolition says the fans were singing, "It's like watching Brazil," while Pardew said the defenders simply could not stop him. So if the thumbnail says they had never seen someone like him, that is the emotional truth we can actually defend. The Premier League had seen dribblers before, but Bolasie arrived as a totally different kind of problem, and in a league obsessed with efficiency, that kind of unpredictable pressure instantly becomes a story supporters cannot stop replaying. He also did not come from the polished conveyor belt people usually expect when they hear Premier League winger. The verified version is weird enough on its own. The Guardian traced his path from non-league Hillingdon Borough and Rushden and Diamonds to the Maltese Premier League, then on through Plymouth, Barnet and Bristol City. BBC Sport described him as a player whose route to the Premier League took in non-league football and the Maltese top flight. That is not the normal map. That is not the tidy academy story. That is a footballer being assembled in public, one stop at a time, long before the big cameras arrived. And the personal background matters because it explains the style. The Guardian describes him as born in Lyon to Congolese parents and raised in northwest London, a grime-loving winger whose career path was not exactly orthodox. That is the profile of someone who was never going to look fully standardized once he reached the top. Bolasie always moved like a player who had learned football in mixed environments, with bits of improvisation still intact. That is why defenders could study him and still look surprised. He was not reading from the same script as the average touchline winger. And what Palace saw was not polish. They saw stress. Dougie Freedman told The Guardian he had wanted exactly that kind of player for a long time, someone who could go by opponents on the outside and create space. That sentence is basically the entire title explained in one line, long before the league started posting his tricks back to people. Coaches already understood the real value. He distorted defenders. He made them turn their hips early, gave center-backs problems when he carried inside, and forced extra cover even when he did not touch the ball. When a player does that, he changes the geometry of a game before he even produces a highlight. Then came the prediction that made the whole thing feel impossible. Tony Finnegan, the former Palace player turned agent, remembered watching Bolasie at Barnet, seeing the raw athleticism and improvisation, and telling his parents he could make their son a Premier League player within 3 years. That sounds ridiculous until you realize he was almost dead on. Bolasie's rise was not a fairy tale because it was easy. It felt unreal because every step looked one level too high until he hit it and kept going anyway. The money side tells you how quickly the perception changed. With Finnegan's help, Bolasie was bought by Bristol City for just £10,000 after a failed medical at Watford, and only a year later Crystal Palace took him for £350,000. That is not a gentle rise. That is a market correcting itself in real time because clubs kept realizing too late that this guy was not a gimmick. The Guardian also points out that in his very first Palace appearance at Selhurst Park, he picked up the ball, beat his marker and delivered a cross for a goal within the opening half-minute. So the first impression was basically the final warning. If you leave him 1v1, something is going to happen. And then Palace became the perfect lab for him. With Wilfried Zaha on one side and Bolasie on the other, opponents had a terrible choice. Overload one problem and leave the other one breathing. Guardian reporting on Palace's promotion run notes that Bolasie's cross helped break the deadlock in the playoff semi-final against Brighton. And BBC Sports report confirms Zaha's 2 goals sent Palace to the final. He was not yet the finished Premier League version, but the outline was already obvious. Pace, improvisation, nerve, and a willingness to try the thing other players would not even attempt. That is how a showboater becomes a serious weapon. And once Palace got moving, the whole climb accelerated. The Guardian notes that after losing their first 3 games, Palace had moved into the top 4 by the time Friedman left for Bolton, with Zaha and Bolasie supplying the ammunition for Glenn Murray. That is another reason the title works. Bolasie was not just doing tricks for mid-table oxygen. He was helping power a promotion push, and every big moment made the talent feel less theoretical. The clips were exciting, sure, but now there was league position attached to them. Stakes turned entertainment into obsession, and Palace supporters were getting both at once. The funniest part is that one of the biggest criticisms of him ended up proving the point. For all the noise around the tricks, the real concern was end product. The Guardian says that despite failing to score a league goal in 2013-14, Bolasie still filled the creative gap left by Zaha's move to Manchester United and was integral to Palace surviving a Premier League season for the first time. Read that again. He went goalless in the league and still felt indispensable. That only happens when your ball carrying, your chance creation, your threat profile and your ability to unhinge a back line are doing enormous work that the scoresheet cannot fully capture. There was also a physical transformation behind the highlights. The Guardian reports that after promotion, Bolasie credited a new fitness program with changing him from what he called a beanpole into a beast. That detail matters because it helps explain why the Premier League version looked so hard to handle. He already had speed and oddball technique, add more power, more balance through contact, more ability to ride challenges, and suddenly defenders are not just dealing with tricks. They are dealing with a dribbler who can absorb the bump, stay upright, and explode again before the recovery step arrives. That is when flair starts becoming a survival weapon. And then there were the Liverpool games, which are a huge reason people remember him the way they do. The Premier League's own Classic Matches piece says Palace fans christened the 3-3 draw in May 2014 Crystanbul because Liverpool's title dream effectively collapsed thereafter. Palace roared back from 3-0 down. Then BBC Sports report on the 3-1 win later that year called Bolasie exceptional and described his skill in the build-up to Joe Ledley's goal as a marvelous piece of skill, while the Premier League said his trickery twisted through the Liverpool defence. That is exactly the sweet spot this title is trying to hit, not empty nostalgia, not fake mythology, just a real player repeatedly producing scenes against elite opposition that made people sit forward. And because one clip can say more than 10 adjectives, go back to the official Palace upload of that skill against Spurs. The club does not even try to undersell it. Insane 360 Bolasie skill against Eriksen, out of a tight space, almost creates a goal. That is the exact Bolasie package in miniature. He could be boxed in, apparently contained, and then in one weird elastic movement the whole picture changed. Fullbacks hated that kind of player because he made basic defensive rules feel unreliable. Stand off and he drives, dive in and he flicks it, send help and you open the lane he wanted in the first place. By the time he went to the 2015 Africa Cup of Nations, the style had already crossed borders with him. BBC Sport confirmed he was in DR Congo's final squad, one of 3 England-based players selected. In the tournament itself, BBC reported that DR Congo came back from 2-0 down to beat Congo for 2-2 in the quarter-final. And Bolasie said afterward, "You saw in the second half what we are capable of." He was not there as a sideshow. He was part of a team that reached the semi-finals and eventually finished third, a fact also confirmed by Crystal Palace's own retrospective. He even announced himself early in that tournament. Reporting on DR Congo's opener against Zambia, The Guardian said Bolasie scored the equalizer in a 1-1 draw, and then BBC tracked the bigger quarter-final comeback over Congo. So the AFCON chapter is not filler. It shows that the same player who unnerved Premier League defenders could also handle the emotional weight of tournament football for DR Congo. Different stage, same effect. Momentum shifts when he starts driving at people. That is why the showboater tag only works if you remember the second half of the label. He was a showboater whose actions kept mattering on the scoreboard. That matters for the bigger argument of this video. The title says African showboater, which can sound dismissive if you are not careful, but the verified version is stronger than the stereotype. Bolasie did bring flair that felt closer to street football than academy automation. He also helped Palace in relegation fights, played key roles in huge Premier League moments, and carried that same unpredictability onto the international stage in meaningful matches. The tricks got attention. The competitive value is what made them stick. Then came the afternoon that turned cult status into full-blown folklore. Palace's official match retrospective says Bolasie scored an 11-minute hat-trick in the 4-1 win away at Sunderland, which remains the club's fastest top-flight hat trick and was their first in the Premier League era. The same club report says Pardew moved him up front and quotes the manager agreeing with the fans who sang, "It's like watching Brazil." On top of that, in Palace's official post-match interview, Bolasie said moments like that don't come around often, and in Pardew's own official interview the manager said Sunderland simply had a player they couldn't stop and called him unstoppable. That is not fan fiction. That is the club itself telling you how wild the performance looked in real time. And this is where the title really cashes in, because once a player has that kind of day on the record, every old clip starts making more sense. The shoulders, the long strides, the sudden cutbacks, the awkward body angles defenders could not quite time. He did not beat people in one clean, textbook way. He beat them in a way that looked improvised, almost accidental, until you noticed he kept surviving the duel and the defender kept losing the duel. That is why Bolasie clips age so well. They still feel slightly illegal even after you have seen them 5 times. And if you want the cleanest summary of his prime, it is this. He helped Palace to one of their most entertaining modern stretches. He helped them reach the 2016 FA Cup final, and he became one of the defining personalities of that team. Palace's own profile says exactly that, not a side character, not just the guy from the compilation edits, a central figure in a period supporters still revisit because it felt alive, loose and dangerous every week he was on it. And just when it looked like Palace might unlock even more from him, the body interrupted the climb again. The Guardian says the club failed to win any of the 9 Premier League matches he missed during a later 2-month absence with a back injury. That is a brutal little detail, because it tells you how much attacking voltage disappeared. When he was gone, a lot of wingers are fun when they are hot. Very few create that level of structural dependence. Palace were not just missing a dribbler. They were missing the player who made defenders retreat and made the stadium believe a broken phase could suddenly become a chance. Now here is where we have to clean up the mythology. The chapter title says the second most expensive African player of all time, but that exact ranking is not something we can responsibly stamp as fact from the sources we checked. What we can verify is still massive. BBC Sport reported that Everton signed Bolasie from Crystal Palace for £25 million on a 5-year deal in August 2016. Bolasie called the move a no-brainer, and in Everton's official press conference he said it was a big step in his career. That is the verified version, and honestly it still lands. He went from the long route and the weird route to a major Premier League move at age. Archichi. Everton's side of the transfer also tells you what top-level coaches thought they were buying. In the BBC report confirming the move, Ronald Koeman said Bolasie had long been on his radar because he was the type of winger he liked. Fast, strong, and able to play different positions across the forward line. That is not how managers talk about novelty acts. That is how they talk about a player whose unpredictability can be weaponized inside a serious Premier League project. Even Alan Pardew, speaking after Palace's opening day defeat before the transfer, admitted Bolasie's heart and soul may be elsewhere. Everybody could see the move coming because everybody could see the value. BBC also notes that he left Palace after 143 appearances and 13 goals. Palace's own retrospective calls the Everton FIA club record sale at the time. So even if we strip away inflated rankings, the arc remains crazy. The same player who looked like a one-off street technician was now being priced like a major Premier League asset. That is usually the point where fans expect the story to level up one more time. Instead, it turned. Because the injury does not need embellishment, BBC reported that Ronald Koeman expected Bolasie to be out around 11 to 12 months after damaging his right knee against Manchester United in December 2016. Reuters later reported that he needed a second operation, with Koeman explaining that the first surgery dealt with the meniscus and the second would address the cruciate ligament. That is the kind of interruption that can break rhythm, confidence, explosiveness, continuity, all of it. You do not need rumors about dressing rooms or medical conspiracies to make it dramatic. The verified timeline is already brutal enough. And from there the story becomes painfully familiar. Not because he suddenly lost the memory of how to play, but because players whose game depends on unpredictability and physical edge can look normal very quickly once the body stops cooperating at the same level. Palace's own summary notes that while he remained on Everton's books, his later years included loans to Aston Villa, Anderlecht, Sporting Lisbon and Middlesbrough. That list tells its own story. A player once framed as a guaranteed source of chaos was now moving from place to place trying to recapture a version of himself everyone had already seen. What makes the late career section hit harder is that the official Palace summary reads almost like a map of detours. Everton, then loans to Aston Villa, Anderlecht, Sporting Lisbon and Middlesbrough, all after the big move that was supposed to cement his peak. That is the football version of watching momentum leak away one season at a time, but it also sharpens the memory of what came before. The reason people still talk about Bolasie with that specific tone is that they are comparing all those later stops to the Palace version who felt half-engineered, half-improvised, and fully capable of turning a normal possession into a small public humiliation for the defender in front of him.